Let's talk about the French neoclassical theater of the 17th century. Theater flourished in 17th century France. This is the time of Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, better known as Molière. The 17th century in France is known as the golden age of neoclassical French theater, and it marked a new interest in Greek and Roman models. Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, ruled France at the time, and he and his court were patrons of the theater. And Molière, and there's a picture of him, lived from 1622 to 1673, and he's considered by many to be the greatest dramatist to come out of France. In fact, he's been called the French Shakespeare. And like Shakespeare, he was an actor and poet as well as a playwright. While his plays were enjoyed by the French royals and nobility, they also drew criticism, for their satire pointed at high society and even religious institutions. Ever the actor, he died a few hours after he collapsed on stage while playing the lead role in his play, The Imaginary Invalid, the one we're going to read. So let's look at some characteristics of French neoclassical theater, and you'll see there a couple of diagrams that show the theater. So in contrast to the English Elizabethan theater, the French neoclassical theater consisted of playhouses that were completely indoors, often built around indoor tennis courts. According to Pickering and Hopper, the single most significant difference in Elizabethan English and neoclassical French theater was the separation from the audience. Whereas the Elizabethan audience had nearly encircled the actors, the 17th century French audience sat along one side of the stage and looked in on the action as if peering through an invisible wall. Eventually, a curtain was used to hide the stage from the audience before performances. These theaters were smaller than those in Elizabethan England. They only seated about 400 patrons. And there you can see the wings and the shutters, the actual stage, the orchestra where where musicians might be. The audiences, or some members of the audience could sit right on stage, and then there was also a standing pit and a raised gallery. Let's look at some more characteristics of French neoclassical theater. Flat canvased panels were used to depict scenery painted using forced perspective, which used optical illusions to make objects seem closer or farther away. Despite the curtain, these were often moved on and off stage in full view of the audience and were considered special effects. So the French neoclassical theater is when we first see scenery being a big deal or an important part of the theater. Every play was required to fulfill three unities: the unity of time, which required that the action take place in a single day; the unity of action, which required one specific major plot and allowed no irrelevant scenes; and the unity of place, which required the play be set in a single setting or vicinity. Plays were performed indoors under artificial lighting that was not very illuminating. As Pickering and Hopper state, the tallow candles then in use burned dimly. The best lighting was above the stage, and the audience was left mostly in the dark. Often wealthy spectators who came to the theater to be seen would sit on the stage to take advantage of the better lighting. Plays written during the Neoclassical period were witty, intellectual, and refined. Pickering and Hopper state that they depicted highly idealized and artificial conversations among men and women, representing broad human types. Classical heroes or gods in tragedy, contemporary scoundrels or buffoons in comedy. And you heard me correctly. The female roles on the French stage were actually played by women. Furthermore, as Pickering and Hopper point out, the plots developed scenes of emotional intensity, but they rarely erupted into the violent activity that so often left the Elizabethan stage littered with bodies. Now, not literally, but in a lot of Elizabethan plays, especially the tragedies, everyone's dead by the end of the play. Not so in the French neoclassical theater. The neoclassical theater in France did not include supernatural elements. There were no witches or ghosts. The action was required to be totally believable. Also, all plays adhered to a strict code of decorum. All characters acted true to their roles in society, and if they did not, they were required to be punished in some way at some point in the story. And finally, the neoclassical theater was expected to delight and instruct. So there was usually a lesson to be learned by the action on stage. Also, there was no mixing of genres. The tragedies were strictly tragedies, depicting the fall of royalty or nobility. Comedies were allowed no somber moments and featured the middle or lower classes. So let's talk about the development of modern theater. In the 19th century, a series of important technical innovations encouraged dramatists to abandon neoclassicism, in favor of a drama characterized by realistic plots performed within equally realistic settings. So in the 19th century, we have the rise of realism. So realism, or the attempt to present life as it actually is, not as we wish it to be, became the dominant form of theater, and realistic plays remain popular to this day. Innovations that led to the rise of realism include gas lighting. Gas lights burned brighter than candles or oil lamps. They allowed for more control of the theater lighting and thus control of the audience's focus. No longer did dialogue need to establish time of day, and the actors were more freely able to move around stage. So when the candles were used and it was dim, you didn't have a lot of movement on stage because the actors needed to stay safe, right? But if it was brighter, you could see, then you can move all over the stage. And this improved lighting led to focused spotlights. More control of the lighting led to the development of the spotlight. According to Pickering and Hopper, spotlights were first achieved by burning small chunks of lime and reflecting the light off curved mirrors onto the leading man or leading lady. Our phrase, "in the limelight," comes from this practice. Curtain use. Originally, the curtain was used to hide the stage before the opening of the play and stayed up until the end. When the curtain began to be used to hide the stage between acts and scenes, it allowed for more elaborate sets with sofas and tables, trees, etc., that could be changed behind the curtain. Furthermore, the actors could already be in place on stage when the scene began. The boxed set. Introduced in 1930, the boxed set was identical to a real room with one wall removed. Even though the audience could peer through this invisible fourth wall to eavesdrop on the action taking place within, the actors would pretend that the invisible wall existed. And then, in more modern and contemporary times, it became a thing to break the fourth wall, to acknowledge the audience again. The writer most seen as responsible for the shift to realism is Henrik Ibsen. He was born in Norway in 1828 and was a playwright and theater director. According to Kennedy and Gioia, he wrote a series of prose dramas in which realistically portrayed middle-class characters face conflicts in their lives and relationships. They are often called problem plays because of their engagement of social issues, such as women's place in society and inherited venereal disease. His most famous plays are A Doll's House, Ghosts, and Hedda Gabler. And this is Henrik Ibsen. According to Pickering and Hopper, 20th century stagecraft has been characterized by flexibility. An improved understanding of the past has allowed us to stage the plays of Sophocles, Shakespeare, Moliere, and others with greater fidelity to the original intentions of the author. Furthermore, modern critical principles encourage playwrights to put aside their traditional notions about staging and recognize that each play requires and deserves a separate approach. Continuing technical developments in the 20th century have facilitated this flexibility both through further refinements in lighting and through machinery that can easily manipulate the sets and sometimes even the seating arrangement in the theater. So while realism remains a popular form in the 20th century and after, dramatic experimentation is present as well. As Saphir and Daniel point out, modern playwrights have experimented with traditional dramatic elements, trying to find new ways of presenting action and character on stage. Some abandon plots altogether. One playwright, Samuel Beckett, in his play Endgame, has his characters speak while sitting inside trash cans. And there you have a picture from a production of Endgame.